Hi everyone, and welcome to the first ever Tech Educators Careers Week. We are joined by Uth, who has his red hat on and a cup of tea, or coffee, one of the two, not sure which one. Um, just wanted to welcome everyone and from everyone at Tech Educators and from the schools, colleges around the country that are joining us. The reason that we host these Careers Weeks is because we understand that we have a responsibility in the wider ecosystem to demonstrate what is possible in a career in tech. As you know, in the UK, there is a massive shortage of people entering the tech market, entering the tech career scene, and believing that they too can have a long and successful career in tech. So we are super excited and grateful to be able to welcome Uth today, who's going to talk to us about developer careers in the age of open source. There'll be a nice Q&A at the end, so if you do have any questions, please do drop them into chat. I can see some incredible people already dropping lots of comments in chat, so thank you for that. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Uth, who's going to talk to us, as I said, about developer careers in the age of open source. So thank you ever so much for joining, Uth, and please, over to you and that incredible red hat.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a quick thing on this. How long should I talk for? How long do you want for Q&A? Because, I can talk for England, so.
Incredible. You've got, well, as long as you please. It would be great to have maybe 10, 15 at the end for Q&A. But I will also moderate the chat, and if you're okay with that, the opportunity for me to dive in with pertinent questions at that point, I'll dive in too. So we'll play it by ear, but hopefully around 10, 15 at the end. The first question, sorry, obviously you got the red hat from Red Hat, but how, if anyone was interested in getting one, do you have to go to a conference, or how would you get yourself one of those red hats?
That's a very good question. You actually get given a red hat when you join Red Hat.
Yeah,
It's the
actually.
last thing they do. Yeah, last thing they do with the new hire to make you officially a Red Hatter is they give you one of these proper red hats,
Oh, there you go.
which I've been wearing for 11 years now. Because I've been a Red Hat for 11 years. I think it might need a wash, but yeah. So yeah, that I would say that's the only reason I work for Red Hat, but that would be a blatant lie.
They don't take it back when you leave, do they?
I don't think they do. They should, but there again, no one ever leaves Red Hat. So
No, a bit ominous.
cool. Right. Hi everybody. My name's Ian Lawson. I am currently a developer advocate for Red Hat. This is the best position I've ever had in my life, in the best company I've ever been in my life. I've been at Red Hat for 11 years. Prior to being a developer advocate, for 10 years, I was what is called a solution architect, specifically what's called a domain solution architect, which is someone who works with the sales teams, but please don't call me a salesperson, and does deep dive tech around the products that Red Hat offers. What I'm going to talk about today is basically the concept of careers within the open source industry. For those who are unaware what open source is, I come from a different generation. I'm actually a lot older than I look. I worked in the software industry for about 20 to 25 years before I joined Red Hat. So that gives you an indication of how long I've been doing this. And when I started in my career, straight out of college, I was working on proprietary software solutions. Back then in 1991, there really wasn't the concept of open source. Open source was kind of unheard of because everyone was making money off of proprietary software. And the problem with that is when you're developing software and it's proprietary, you only ever change it if you want to increase your growth base or you want to make more money. So the changes to the software are only ever done to reflect the ability for the company to make more money off of it. And what that led to was this revolution around about the year 2000, where people decided that, number one, software shouldn't be proprietary. Software should be shared. And number two, if you write software specifically to solve a problem as opposed to make money, you get better software. And the way I've always pitched it from an open source perspective is open source is the natural selection of software. It's the way you actually go and actually write software to directly solve a problem. No one ever writes open source to make money. It's a ridiculous concept to try and think that you can actually make your fortune out of writing an open source piece of software. But the beauty of it is that when you write a piece of open source software, because you're solving a problem and because it's open to the entire world and everyone can see it, the best solutions go to the top. And things that don't quite work kind of fall to the side and they wither. So you always get best of breed when you're dealing with open source software. But I'll give you a quick overview of how I got here in terms of my career. As I said, I left college in 1991 with a degree in computer science. I started work with the military. I actually joined the army for a little bit. I ended up in government space at a certain place in Cheltenham for a long time. Writing search engines. I got a PhD in artificial intelligence. I went down the route of actually writing sort of software specifically around the AI concept. And this was about, so 20 years ago, before AI was popular. But the major difference when you're writing software in a proprietary perspective or from an open source perspective is that when you're in the open source community, when you're writing software from an open source perspective, you're actually interacting with thousands of people. And it's a very good way to actually get to learn software and to get your software out into the actual industry itself. Now, in terms of careers from an open source perspective, I work for a company called Red Hat, which the majority of the people in the world don't seem to have heard of. I actually showed up to a customer site in Glasgow about 3 years ago, and I walked in with my Red Hat jacket on and walked up to the desk and said, "Hi, I'm from Red Hat." And the security guy behind the desk said, "Oh, are you here to fix the elevators?" So it's kind of, people don't know what Red Hat does. Now, to explain what Red Hat does and explain what open source is from a perspective of the software side, I talk about something called the 4:30 in the morning stack trace. And the reason I talk about this is that one of my first roles when I was working with a government agency was to build a search engine. So I wanted to write a search engine from scratch because I'm an idiot. And I sat down and realized that it was incredibly hard to do. And I went out onto the web to see if anybody had actually written one. And there was an open source project called Lawson. And Lawson was a proper search engine core. Fantastic. It's still going today. It underpins things like Elasticsearch and Solr. And I thought, oh, that'd be brilliant. I'll just lift it and I'll put it in my application and we'll go from there. So I uploaded this open source software onto the system and I wrote a nice web interface around it. And I wrote some pretty, user interfaces and all those kind of things for interacting with the software. And I delivered a product, which is my search engine. And I drove home to Bristol from Cheltenham, and I went out and had a couple of drinks, and then went to bed. And then 4:30 in the morning, the phone rings, and it was the agency saying there's a stack trace in your software. And of course, I thought, whoops, what have I done? So I rushed back up to Cheltenham, had a look at the software, and this stack trace was coming from within the open source component. I downloaded the open source component for Lawson. I built it. I'd actually added it to my system, but I hadn't written that source material. It was open source material. So I was sat there with stack traces thinking, I don't know what's going on here. I only wrote the front end for this, but because I'd taken the open source software and made it part of my project, I owned it. And that's the key issue you've got when you're actually working with open source software is there's no support for it. It's community support. So what Red Hat does is we actually take open source software, we harden it, we make it enterprise strength, and then we release it to the outside world, including the source material for free. But we actually charge people for what is called a subscription. And a subscription allows you to use any version of the products that we release. And we provide support over the running instance of that product. So you don't have the 4:30 in the morning stack trace issue because Red Hat actually does the support for you. Now, the thing with the open source community is that there are millions of people writing software out there and millions of people actually putting stuff into the open source community. And as I said, the best stuff rises to the top, the best stuff gets pulled and used by organizations and things like that. If you want a career in open source, you have to stop thinking of it as a career. This is a pitch I used to do internally at Red Hat and to customers as well. And that is, people don't understand what developers are. So if you're coming into this now, you're leaving school, you're leaving college, you've got a degree, you've got some education, and you want to get into the IT industry. If you want to be a developer, it has to be a passion. It can't be a job. If it's not a job, if it's a chore, if it's not something you enjoy, then you just will not get on with it. You have to love it. And I used to describe this as being an artist because you're creating things. And a lot of developers have that artistic mindset. So for a lot of us who work in the open source community, and a lot of us work for Red Hat, it isn't a job. This is pleasure. I get up in the morning, I want to turn my laptop on. I want to use my laptop, I want to write software, I want to interact with new stuff, I want to play with it. And it gets to 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, and I have to physically pull myself away from my laptop, turn it off and walk away. And it's not a job. And believe me, I've had jobs in my career. I've had jobs that I absolutely detest. And they were mostly around proprietary software, and they're mostly around sort of rigid compartmentation. But open source software is a joy to work with if you've got that creative mindset. And the beautiful advantage of that is if you're passionate about these kind of things, as I said, it's not a job, it's a pleasure. And it's all about creativity. If you want to be rich, then don't get into open source development, don't get into software at all, because there are other ways you could take a career in IT. There are other ways you can go to management, you can go into sales and all these kind of things where you can make a lot of money. But if you're a developer and you're a creative person, that's not where you want to be. So my first real message on this is that when you're working with open source software and you want to get a career started in open source software, it has to actually be a pleasure. The best thing to do is to look at the open source communities, find something you've got a real passion for, and find the kind of projects that are building up around that kind of passion. For me, it was artificial intelligences and it was search engines. So when I was looking at the open source communities back in the day when they first started, I was instantly drawn to Lucene because it did everything I wanted to do. And I could write things above and beyond it, and I could add things to it. I could commit code back to that repository. And it was a pleasure, and you find yourself, if you love this kind of job, if you love being a developer, you're doing it in your spare time as well. And I used to joke to customers that the lovely thing about working for Red Hat is that I don't care what day it is. I wake up in the morning. In the old days, I used to look at the calendar, look at my clock. Oh God, it's Monday. Oh God, it's Tuesday. Long time to the weekend. And then when I was working, it was sort of it's 3:30. I've still got an hour and a half of this stuff to do. You don't get that when you find a job you love. And the open source community is such a wonderful place for innovation, for kind of academic approach to things. And a good way to describe Red Hat, I always describe it this way to customers, is that Red Hat feels like a university and a startup meshed into one, pretending to be a company. Everything within within the actual organization itself feels like a university because we are embedded with the open source community. In fact, the majority of Red Hat people are open source contributors. It just feels absolutely brilliant. Every single day, I can just log on to the actual systems and see something new coming down the pipeline and see some new technology that's just dropped. And that's a lovely place to be if you're a creative, if you're someone who loves that kind of innovation and stuff like that. I get asked by a lot, because I do a lot of work with grad programs. We've got a fantastic grad program at Red Hat where every year we take a certain amount of people as a grad intake, and then we rotate them through all the actual divisions within Red Hat itself. Because Red Hat is made up of a number of different components. We have a sales team, massive sales organization that sells those subscriptions, talks directly to the customers and generates revenue. And us developers don't really talk to them because even though I worked in the division for 10 years, we don't really get on well with salespeople. We've also got engineers, and the engineers at Red Hat are actually open source contributors. Everything we write goes back into the community. We actually build communities. We establish communities. And you've also got what we call services. And services are the frontline soldiers. They're the people that actually go into an organization after the organization has purchased a product and help them get it running, help them fix problems and all those kind of things. And you've got that kind of nice balance. If you want to be a creator, you can come and work in the engineering units. where you sit at your laptop all day and you generate open source code. You contribute to the open source projects. You actually build stuff that moves the products forward or moves the projects forward. Or you can come in as a member of services. And services are the guys that go and sit in the front line. They're the ones that deal with the nitty-gritty problems every day. And I did that for 20 years, and it's a wonderful, if you like a challenge, it's a wonderful job, absolutely superb job. The problem with working in something like services is you're working hard all the time, and especially at Red Hat, because you are the Red Hat people on site. But as I was saying, we've got a grad program. This grad program, actually, we bring people in and we push them through each of the units. So you go into services, you spend a little bit of time in what we call the business units, which are the engineers. You spend a little time in support, because we've got a massive support contingent as well, who actually deal on a one-to-one basis with customers who have problems. And you have spend some time in the sales and pre-sales unit as well. But I'm making it sound a bit corporate. There is nothing corporate about Red Hat. Nothing corporate about Red Hat whatsoever. And that's one of the beautiful things about it. And I used to say in meetings that I was going to die at Red Hat, which isn't a good thing to say, really. But the actual meaning behind that is that I've worked in so many different places, in so many different companies. I've had my own company for a while. I was a freelance contractor for 10 years. I always wanted to feel part of something. And Red Hat and the open source community is a perfect way to feel part of something. But to take a step back, if you want to get into the concept of open source programming, if you want to get into the actual communities themselves, it is incredibly easy to get started with open source. And a lot of people are put off because when you actually start going to look at the open source projects, you'll find there's a lot of geniuses in there, a lot of people who really know their stuff. And it can be quite off-putting. You want to get involved, you want to write some software, you want to commit to these kind of things. And if you're anything like me, where you've got zero self-confidence, it could be a bit of a jump to actually get involved and put your stuff out for people to actually critique. But what I've always found with open source is that these communities are inherently friendly. And that's another one of these differences. You don't have the same level of competition that we used to have in proprietary software vendors. Because in the old days, for example, if you wanted to write a database or get involved with database programming, you could go and work for Oracle, or you could go and work for Sun, or you could go and work for one of these big proprietary vendors. And everything was very tight, locked down. You had to work within the restrictions of the company. With open source, everything is effectively open. And that it brings around this kind of concept of camaraderie, of community, which is a fantastic word. And you don't have that kind of rivalries. I mean, you do get some personality issues with people in open source because you're dealing with creative people. But on the whole, it's a wonderfully friendly place to actually work and actually get involved in. And one of the things I say to the grads when they actually start is that you really should cut your teeth on committing some code to an open source repository. Now, what I did was I actually created an open source project just for the hell of it, to see what happened. And I was the only committer for a long, long time. But once you understand the mechanisms by which you write the software and commit the software and do all those kind of things, it starts to become second nature how open source actually works. And the one thing to remember, which people tend to get a little bit confused about, is that when you're talking about open source, it's open source. The source you write for your software is put out into the community. The majority of cases, 99.9% of the cases, we use Git repos to actually stand up the projects. So you can actually commit into those Git repos. But you're only committing the source. If people want to build the application, they have to take that source, they have to build the libraries, they have to build the application, they have to host the application, and all those kind of things. And people tend to have lost sight of the fact that open source is open source. There are things like licenses you actually have for open source. So there's something called the GPL. And what the GPL does is it promises, if you actually release a piece of source, that source can be used by anyone in the outside world, whatever they want to do with it. What they're not allowed to do with it is actually take the source as is and charge for it. Because the open source community, the whole mechanisms around the open source are completely abstracted away from the commercial world. And that's where Red Hat actually sits in two worlds. It was a very, very clever idea to commercialize an aspect of the open source community without tainting it, without damaging it, because you have to have a freedom of innovation within the open source communities. It's how the open source communities live. And going back to what I was saying about natural selection, there are many solutions to problems. You could have, for example, 15 open source projects for search engines, and the best one will be the one that's used the most. People actually pull down all the search engines they like, they build them, they trial them, they thrash them, and all these kind of things. And the one that performs better, the one that doesn't have as much memory footprint, the one that's got functionally rich API, is the one that succeeds. And what you normally find is that all those competitive open source projects will actually wither on the vine, and people will start to commit to the ones that go forward. And this is what I mean about natural selection. It's that kind of survival of the fittest, but it's done from a software perspective. And that kind of methodology, that kind of way of thinking, is something that was never prevalent in the proprietary software industry. And you're very lucky to be joining the industry or wanting to join the industry at this point, because not only have you got the concept of open source, which is now basically taking over. There are very, very few vendors out there that have got proprietary source now, or 100% proprietary source. But the other thing is, like, when the internet came around, year 2000 onwards, the whole nature of the internet is a breeding ground for open source. And the internet has its ups, it has its downs. The whole concept of social media is a very, very dangerous concept. But the fact that everything is open means that the concepts of open source can propagate, and you get this wonderful kind of breeding ground for innovation. And that was one of the reasons I joined Red Hat in the first place, is that I was watching the industry to see what was going on in terms of the places that I was interested in, the artificial intelligence side, the machine learning, the massive data processing and stuff like that. And I could see that the open source communities were leagues ahead of everyone else, because they were trying things and failing, trying things and failing. And because there was no commercial goal behind open source, you're only driven by the goal of perfection. And that is such an eye-opener for me. And you're extremely lucky at this point. This is the best point in history so far to get involved with the IT industry. Because, as I said, not only have you got the concept of open source, you've also got the concept of the internet. And there are some pity reasons for that. In the old days, when you were starting a career in IT, when you were starting a career in software, you used to sit at a desk that had no connectivity to the outside world. There was no concept of the internet when I actually started work. And so when you wanted to write a piece of software, you had to sit there with a book and a terminal and just try things. And so that in and of itself made it much more difficult, and it dissuaded a lot of people from going down the software route. Nowadays, because you've got the internet, Google is always 6 clicks away. Any problem you've got, you can just do an English language Google query and you'll get 50 solutions to it. And the majority of the solutions you get for that problem will be part of an open source project. So you've got this communication protocol where you can actually just go out and ask people things. And that makes it much easier to pick up and learn new technologies. So that's a real advantage if you're starting down this route. Talking very quickly about software itself. So when we talk about the IT industry, there are many different roles that you can go into when you join the IT industry. I've got a lot of friends who are grads, and out of those grads, I would probably say, if 10 of my friends are grads, 3 of them are interested in writing software. And they are real sort of innovative creators who want to actually build something, who want to see something come to fruition, who love the idea of actually contributing and actually producing something. And out of the other 7, they want to go into management. They want to go into solution architecture, where you actually basically talk to customers or talk to end people about how you put systems together. And there's a massive range of these things. So you don't have to be an absolute expert in writing software to be involved in the open source communities. A lot of open source communities, they have a lot of people who are involved with actually consuming the software as opposed to actually producing the software. Because one of the major features of open source projects is the agility of feedback. And that's another reason why proprietary software is withering on the vine and having problems. If you've got a piece of proprietary software and it's got a problem with it, you can talk to the vendor and say, well, this is wrong or this is broken. And the vendor's got no responsibility to fix it whatsoever. They could look at that problem and say, well, we can fix that, but it's not going to add to our bottom line. It's not going to give us any more revenue. So we'll put that on the to-do later pile. With an open source project, you have what's called an RFE, a request for enhancement. And you can go onto GitHub and you can raise an issue and say, well, I think it'd be better if it did this, or there's a problem with this. And you can actually suggest solutions, or even you can build the software to solve that problem and actually push that in as what's called a pull request into the Git repo, contributing that piece of code to fix it. The ability to have this kind of concept of RFE means that you've got an agility of the actual project itself, and it's always changing. And the beautiful thing is that, if you've got an RFE that comes in that is actually going to enhance the project or add functionality to the project, then there's a high probability that someone's going to look at that from within the project and go, that's a brilliant idea, and write it and add it. And if you've added the code yourself or contributed the code to do that kind of change, then suddenly you're a contributor, you're part of that project. It requires a lot more community thought. And that's one of the dichotomies of actually being a software engineer or being in the software side of the open source communities. You are part of a big mass. There are very few, extremely few open source projects that are written by one person and maintained by one person. It's always a team effort. And working in a team was one of the things I was dying to do for so many years, because unfortunately, because of the nature of work I used to do and the people I used to work for, I always tended to end up doing it myself. So I'd be sat in a room by myself, writing software, building it, debugging it, fixing it, testing it, all those kind of things. If you do that, it stifles innovation because you're not getting any external pressure to change. You're not seeing other people's ideas or other people's ways of doing things. With an open source community, it's a complete open plane. And some people might do things wrong, some people might do things right. But from a learning perspective, you can learn so much from just watching how an open source project evolves, how it changes. And the other beautiful thing is a lot of innovations in the world today, in the world of software, are actually coming specifically from open source, because people are taking risks, they're changing radical things. I'll give you a very good example of this. It's sometimes a giggle to work for Red Hat, especially when I was in the sales organization, because I go out to customers and I talk about our products, and I talk about the next generation, what was coming, and all these kind of things. And whilst I was doing that on a day-to-day basis, things would radically change. And you can do that in open source. So we were developing a project called API Man, which is an API management project for a project called JBoss. And it was written in Java, and what it did was basically control who could call an API. It would throttle it, do all these fantastic things. And I went to a customer who was interested in APIs and said, we're developing this thing called API Man. It's going to be released in the next month or so. Are you interested? They were like, yeah, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we want. And I came back happy that I talked to them and these guys were interested. And there was an email in my mailbox saying, oh, stop talking about API Man. We just acquired a company that does API management called 3Scale. And so overnight, we just changed the project, changed the product, because you can do that and you should do that from a software perspective when you're dealing with the open source world. It's radical, it shifts, the release cadence is incredibly fast. And that agility is what brings innovation. You don't fall into ruts, especially if those ruts can be fixed by a change in software or a change in direction. You're not driven by the shareholder. You're not driven by a company saying, well, this is our product and we're generating revenue for it, so you can't radically change it. So there's a bit of rebellion in there. There's a bit of sort of, it's odd for me to say, I always wanted to be some kind of software anarchist, even though I worked in the military and I worked with software systems that really did not need that kind of anarchy. And it just seems like all my dreams have come true. The open source community has flourished massively over the last 20 years. The internet has flourished massively. And you've got this radicalism in the way that software is written and the way that software is designed. And the beautiful thing about working for a company like Red Hat is it bridges that gap between the radicalism and the wide open frontier of what you can do with software to making it enterprise strength so it's acceptable for companies that don't want risk. And it's a lovely balance, because if you're, as I say, if you're using open source software, or you've got a customer that's using open source software without having support upon it, then they support it, the customer themselves, even though they didn't write it. So Red Hat saw a niche that is very, very difficult to fill, but they filled it, and they're unique across the industry. There are other companies that have tried to do this model, but they've never really succeeded in the way that Red Hat did. Red Hat succeeded because, number one, they had and still have one of the best enterprise distributions of Linux. And secondly, they got this fantastic thing called OpenShift. And I've got to avoid talking about OpenShift because OpenShift is an enterprise strength version of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is an open source project for orchestration of containers. And that sentence, orchestration of containers, 3 words. I could talk for 16 to 20 hours on how beautiful the design of Kubernetes is. Kubernetes, if you go away and look at it, the actual physical design of Kubernetes is the apex of an open source design. It does exactly what it should do in a fantastic, abstracted way. The design of it is just beautifully elegant. It's incredibly complicated, but once you understand what's going on under the covers, it's beautifully simple. But you would never have had a proprietary software vendor build a software system like Kubernetes. It's too vast, it was too radical, it was too different. It was a complete abstraction from the way in which software was written. And yet we now have it, and it now underpins the majority of software going forward. Kubernetes and containers are the next generation, full stop. They solve so many problems in terms of efficiency, in terms of ease of use, that it's just absolutely incredible. And you would never see that other than through something like open source. So I've been talking for 32 minutes now. I'm going to take a quick break and ask James, are there any questions so far? Is that making sense? I also want to drink my tea before it gets too cold.
Wow, for me, how you can speak so captivatingly for 32 minutes was incredible. So thank you for that. I was literally to say like one day might be able to hold a room for that well. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, a few questions that have come through already, and I'm hesitant of diving too quickly and to allow you to drink that tea, which is probably
It's
lukewarm at
cold.
best. But I'm cold.
It's cold, but luckily it's pleasant when it's cold.
You said find projects that are your passion. And I guess the question that's come through is where would you even start? I mean, I assume that people understand what their passion is first, but how would you find a project? Would it be a Google search? Would you try and just find something on GitHub? Where would you even start in trying to find something that you, as a junior, could contribute to?
Google's always a good place to start, and it's a bit difficult for me to say that because I've got a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. And I used to love Google, but Google has become a little bit commercial. So when you do a search on Google, the search rankings don't actually reflect what the internet is now. They reflect sort of commercialization, but it's always a good place to start. But as I said, the best way to do this is to find something that you love, something that interests you. And now is a very good time, for example, with AI.
Yeah.
AI is on the ascendancy, and again, devil and angel. I've been doing AI for 25 years, and artificial intelligence is such a broad term, and it's been hijacked a little bit by, for example, ChatGPT. And ChatGPT, without going off on a 1-hour rant, is I always thought ChatGPT was actually 100 interns in a room with a very poor search engine at the front of it. Because it's a plagiarism engine. It's not artificial intelligence. So if you take a step back, my passion is AI. So I go and, if I want to learn anything about AI, I do a quick search on Google for AI, and then I follow the links. And you can go and search GitHub, but GitHub is not a good place to search because there are so many projects on GitHub and you can't really see which ones are successful. What I would say is this: go to Google, find something you love, do a search on it, find some links to GitHub, go and look at GitHub, but then look at when that project was last contributed to. and look at how often it's contributed to. Because if it's got a very good cadence, if it's got a very fast cadence and sort of it says updated 30 minutes ago, then you know that that is red hot at the moment. That's being worked on. People are actually going bananas. If you find something that claims to be the best piece of software in the world, and it was last updated a year ago, then you've got basically a stale project. There are communities you can get on. Reddit's a good place to go. A lot of these open source people are a bit old school. So they like using Reddit, and they like using sort of, I hate to say it, but IRC, for those people who remember IRC, and there's probably like 2 of us on this call that remember IRC. But yeah, Google's always a good place, but you have to have an idea to start with. And you don't have to know everything about this. You know, are you interested in data? Are you interested in text analytics? Are you interested in languages? Not programming languages, but spoken languages. Find something that you can relate to, that gives you interest, that you won't define to be a job. And I made that mistake. And I said, I hate to say it, but I'm 32 years into my career now. And out of those 32 years, 19 to 20 years of it, I was doing a job I hated, absolutely hated it, because I wanted to innovate, and I wanted to write cool software, and I wanted to do things. And I was working in a compartmented environment where it was, today you will write this, and today you will write that. And you end up feeling like a code monkey. You've got to have an idea where you want to go to, but you only get there through experience. And one of the things I found with the grads that I deal with at Red Hat, and sometimes I want to shake them, but then I'd be told off, is that they come in with sort of very fixed ideas of what they want to do. I want to be an artificial intelligence developer, and it's like, well, do you know what AI is? When you say you want to be an AI developer, where's that coming from in your head? And I'm going to be brutally honest. With me, I watched The Terminator in 1984. And I thought, this is brilliant. And then I watched The Matrix in 1999. I thought, this is even better. And it's literally, those things drove me down the AI route. It was pure entertainment that drove me down that route. And what's funny is I can go back and look at things like Terminator and The Matrix and stuff like that and go, that's ridiculous. And all these news reports at the moment saying, oh, the world's going to be taken over by AI. No, it isn't. Absolutely not. We're nowhere near that. But if you've got that kind of ability to bridge what you think is fun and what you love with a career, you're set for life.
Yeah,
because it's not a job anymore.
I think you made a really excellent point of that earlier. I think you found something when you can wake up every day and you're genuinely excited to go into your career. I don't want to call it a job because again, it kind of job paints it a picture of it's like this horrible, tedious thing that you've got to do. Whereas a career for me is something where you want to wake up every day and you feel excited and invigorated to go in. And I think that this industry definitely allows you to do that. And I think it's not easy to find that, but you can find it. A couple more questions really coming in around pushing that first change, pushing that first commit that you talked about earlier. It could be intimidating to try and push change to a code base that more experienced devs have written. And I think you sort of alluded to it earlier, really. Do you just go for it to find a project that's, sorry, I can't read the full message here, that has an issue that's ready to fix? How would you go about sort of coming over that hurdle of just getting that first commit into a project and almost making yourself known at that point, I suppose, as well?
Yeah, I say it's a big step. It's a big step. I'm going to be honest, and I say don't laugh too much about this, but my first commit I ever did, because I came from a non-open source background. I came from a proprietary background. I've got a laptop here that's got terabytes of source code on that's never going to see the open source world because I wrote it. But the first commit I ever did was a documentation change. So we got this fantastic project called OpenShift, and it's the worst named project in the world. It should be Red Hat Enterprise Kubernetes, but that translates to wreck. And we don't want to call a product wreck. So we called it OpenShift. Now, if you think about OpenShift, it's very easy not to type the F. And I found a piece of documentation where someone had missed the F out. And I'm not going to say it out loud because people work it out in your head what happens if you miss the F out of OpenShift. So I did a commit to just change that back from the naughty word to the actual thing. And it was just a documentation. It was just basically a correction. And I committed it. and it was accepted, and it went into the code base and all these kind of things. And I was a committer. And it was like, wow. I didn't try to just solve the world or do these kind of things. You don't have to do that to be a committer. And once you're a committer, you can look at what other people are doing and all these kind of things. Another way to do it, to be honest, if you're feeling brave, is to create a project. And that project might wither on the vine. But there's nothing stopping you creating a project and actually putting your own source code into it and seeing what other people think of it. But no, it is a big thing, and I'm still, after all these years, I'm still terrified when I do a submission of a piece of code, because I've just got no confidence about my code whatsoever. I know I write good code, but I write good 1996 code, not good 2023. I'm a Java programmer, so I love Java to pieces. And my Java is just old school 1996, 1997 Java. And I've got a number of grad colleagues who write Java, and they look at my code and it's like, oh dear God, what is that? So I still get those things, but it is, you need to make an effort, and you might get bounced, but just make an effort. The open source community is a lot more open and a lot more warm to people. If you're enthusiastic, you'll get on in the open source communities, and that's the beauty of it. It's one of these kind of communities. The whole thing, it just encourages creativity. And having spent a lot of my career in jobs that don't encourage that, this for me is just it's manna from heaven.
And when you say getting bounced, I assume that means being rejected. Would you generally get some feedback as to why it's been rejected?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I've had a number of submissions rejected because they've already been fixed. So I've seen a problem and I've thought I can fix that because I've looked at the RFEs and the issue logs on our GitHub project. And I thought that's easy to fix. So I've done a bit of code up, and I've put a pull request where you actually put your code change back in to be reviewed. And I've had a bounce saying that's fixed in issue 2022. So you might get a situation. This is the other beautiful thing about it, is what happens when that happens is I look at the code change that was done and compare it to my code. And if I think my code is better, which I don't, but if I did, I can resubmit that as an update to the code fix. It's a lovely. I can't enthuse enough about how lovely it is compared to how it used to be when you used to write software. Because you used to write software all by yourself and then submit it into your team, and your team would all sit there and all these kinds of things. You've got a much wider audience when you work with open source software, but you've got a much wider community that can give you backup, that can give you support. And the other lovely thing about open source software is that you don't have that kind of drive or push that you have when working proprietary software. Because one of the reasons I stopped working in the proprietary industry was I got a little bit burnt out from these delivery dates. So you'd work so hard up until the delivery date, and then you'd deliver something, and the next day it'd be like reset, start again. 2 months waterfall, waterfall design, 2-month period. This is your design. Write this, write this, write this, write this. Deliver, break, start again, and it just burns you out. Now with open source, you can commit 5 times a day. You can commit once a month. You can commit once a year. There's no drive, as long as you're writing good software and as long as you're actually being involved in it. And that's a completely more relaxed approach to it. And I like that because I can be as busy as I like, or I can relax. And it's very, very quickly there. I've been giving this talk to a lot of people lately. There are 2 types of pressure in this world. You have what's called stress, and you have what's called pressure. And pressure is basically a push from the outside on you that you can address. And stress is pressure from the outside that you can't address. So when we used to work in proprietary software, you used to have a lot of stress, a lot of push on you to deliver this now, do this, and there just weren't enough hours in the day to do it. Open source, you've got a lot of pressure. It's like, can we do this fix? Can we do this? But you can achieve it, so you can push energy against it, whereas you can't with stress. So for people actually coming into this industry now, you're not going to have the level of burnout that we had in the IT industry from the 90s and the early 2000s, where people were just burning out because they were working so hard, and it was a task you couldn't resolve.
It's quite interesting, actually, in a way to
yeah,
look at it as well, because of the fact that the community almost decides what the next change, the next bug fix, the next direction for the project is. when you talk about stress as well that's being enforced on you, generally it's because in closed source, in proprietary software development, it's because there's almost a mandatory direction you have to change, which is generally driven by customer demand, right? So it's like the customer is demanding this, and therefore they're putting a date and a time on it, and
Yeah,
whether or not that's even achievable. Whereas a community understanding and defining the direction of the next stage of the project, it's one because, as you said earlier, it's something that the community has decided that is actually the best way to take the direction of the project quickly, but also because there's, I imagine, a much more greater understanding of how quickly the project's moving on, and when that delivery timescale will be, providing the project, as you said, hasn't withered.
yeah, yeah. And the one thing I'd add to that is the, you know, now on every single one of the open source projects has a singular goal. And that's the difference. When you're selling proprietary software is basically you get a chunk of software that does security, that does database, that does this, and it's sold as a package, as a unit. Open source projects are always singularly focused on solving a single problem. So you have a search engine, or you, in case of OpenShift, it's an enterprise version of Kubernetes. And that abstraction of responsibility in terms of what you're producing means you've got a much cleaner focus on what the project should do. In fact, what's also amusing about this, and this is again comes from my discussions with customers, is that Kubernetes is a beautiful, beautiful, elegant solution that is one big security hole. And the reason it's one big security hole is security is too hard a concept to build into Kubernetes. So as an open source project, they said, right, Kubernetes, its responsibility is actually orchestration of containers. And we'll pass off responsibility for security and, you know, locking these things down to whatever hosts Kubernetes. So Kubernetes didn't become bloated or complicated by security because there was a thin focus on, right, Kubernetes is a container orchestrator. And that's an open source concept. Everything is focused on a single solution. And so you get best of breed, you get natural selection, but you just get good software. And that's the beauty of it.
I just wanted to take it back as well to the, because I think imposter syndrome, which is one of the key themes of this careers week, is a very real and tangible thing in the industry, especially with juniors. And I think when you were talking earlier about the fact that you can look at other people's commits and how they solved it, I think that sounds like a really great way of almost educating yourself in fixing problems or
Yeah.
creating solutions. So I imagine what you can do is actually go through what the request was and what the change was. You can almost noodle up your solution, and then, as you said, review the solution that was actually pushed and compare notes, and almost take the learnings of, hold on a second, oh, I understand why they've done it this way as opposed to how I would have done it. And I imagine you can't really get that in a living thing from something that's proprietary because you never see it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the one thing I'd add to that is a very good point on the imposter syndrome. Is that even now, I'm at the tail end of my career, I still feel like I know nothing, and it's strange. And the reason is, and it's a good thing, is the technology is changing so fast. You cannot be an expert. It's got to, you know, we've got an exponential increase in technology at the moment in terms of the open source projects, in terms of the complexity of what we're trying to do. And it's not like 20, 30 years ago where you could say, I'm going to be a database expert. I can come in and, you know, my career is going to be about databases. I'm going to focus on databases. And at the end of the day, I'm going to be an expert in databases. You can't do that today. And that's one of the things I have to talk grads around when I'm talking to grads at Red Hat, is don't come in and expect or aim to be an expert, because the transition and the cadence of the technology at the moment means that every day you're learning something new. But the beautiful thing about it is every day you're learning something new. And that is, you know, and it's one of those terribly pithy statements, and I used to hate people saying it, but you need to be changing. Every day you need to learn something new, because the way your brain works is that if you have one thing in your head and you focus on it and you're great at it, your brain stops to actually give you endorphins from it. So you need that change every single day. But you need to understand that that doesn't make you inferior. It doesn't make, because you don't know things, that doesn't make you less than anyone else in the industry. We're all just pretending to know what we're talking about because the industry is moving so fast at the moment in terms of technology. And there's a part of me that internal sort of anarchist just loves that. I love the fact I can come up and get, start a day, fire up my browser, and there'll be a name of a project I've never heard of. And it'll be, what on earth is that? And I'll Google it and I'll go, that is so cool. I'm gonna have a play with that today.
And I think that absolutely links back into this. As long as you've got that hunger and that desire to continue learning, for me, I think that absolutely links into what you're saying earlier about a career versus a job. As
Yeah,
long as you've still got that fire, that desire, and that want to keep learning, then it won't feel like a job because it'll feel like a journey that you're taking as an individual over something which is just actually, I'm here, I've got to be here, I've got to do this thing. And I imagine being in the open source community, ultimately you get to choose where you allocate your time as well, especially if it's personal projects. So that fire, that desire, and that hunger should still be there. One
yeah.
of the questions that we had earlier, actually, just linking into the fact that you said do you still get days though where you wake up and just go, oh, I can't, not today? And how do you deal with those?
Um, yeah. It's, there are days when like today,
Oh,
for
thanks.
example. No, I spent all weekend playing Diablo 4 on my PS5. So I spent all weekend playing Diablo 4, and I woke up on this morning and I thought, is it Sunday? Oh, it's Monday. But that wasn't because I dislike what I'm doing. That's because I really enjoy playing Diablo 4. No, it's a very good question, and there are days when things just don't go right. When you look at software and it won't go into your head, and you sit there and the problem we've got is a lot of people that are in this industry, a lot of people from a software development perspective have a certain personality set. And that personality set is that we're creators, we're artists, and you're always very self-critical, always very
Yeah, for
self-critical.
sure.
And you can find yourself having a day where you've had a fantastic set of meetings or you've done a fantastic piece of software. At the end of the day, you go, well, I didn't achieve anything today. And it's just down to your own perception, just down to your own perception. The lovely thing about the situation with the industry at the moment is that if you get stuck on something or you feel you're not achieving something or this, take a step back, Google something else, or even just walk away from the laptop.
Yeah.
Um, this isn't like the old days where you had to sit at your desk at 9 o'clock. You were allowed to get up at 12 for half an hour to go and get a stale sandwich, and then you waited to 5 o'clock when the whistle went and went and got in your car and drove home.
You
Those
got
days
half
are
an hour for lunch. Wow.
out for lunch.
They let you have that much.
Yeah, but no toilet breaks. It's not like that nowadays. That every single company is much more open to maintaining the mental health of people that work for them, and there's a lot of focus on making sure you don't burn people out and people don't have these kind of problems. So what I tend to do when I'm having a bad day is basically I'll just walk away from the keyboard and I'll go do some exercise. I'll go and do some cycling or just a quick run or something just to burn up some energy and get the endorphins going, or just change what I'm doing completely. If I'm stuck on something, I'll switch to another railway line
Yeah.
and do something else.
And that's
Um,
so important. So important.
yes, yeah. It's one of those. Again, it's a pity thing, but you've got to keep your mental health at the front of your mind, even when you're doing all these things. You can be having the best of days, the best of weeks, and you can wake up the next day and the chemicals in your head have switched,
Hmm.
and it's the worst day of your life.
Yeah.
And you got to understand that that is coming from an internal perspective, not from an external perspective.
Correct. Yeah. No, I think that's super important. I think even with students on the course, one of the things that we try and say is, a 15-minute rule. If you're working on something for 15 minutes and it's not going in, it's not sinking in, stop, get up, go away from your desk, and getting away from your desk even for 5 minutes, thinking about something else. There's something still whirring, I find, in the back of my mind. And when I get back to my desk, I've solved it. And I didn't feel like I was thinking or worrying on it. You can really get yourself trapped in a situation where you're constantly worrying about something. And it's like, again, which comes back to this point you talked about earlier of deadlines and hard deadlines and external pressure, which we exasperate ourselves and we put so much pressure on ourselves. So I think there's some
Absolutely.
really, really great advice there. I think we now hit time, and I just wanted to say, it's seriously like what an incredible opener to Careers Week, and the fact that you could talk so passionately and on the responses so quickly, I've greatly appreciated. Um, so thank you ever so much. Um, you are available on Twitter, is that right? Are you okay to share those socials or not? We'll do that another time maybe.
I'm available on LinkedIn. You
On
can search
LinkedIn.
for Ian Lawson on LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter because does Twitter still exist?
So, ooh.
But anyway, I think I've been told to get on Mastodon,
Oh,
which
there
I
you
haven't
go.
got yet.
That's the
But,
future. But
but so
if
just find me on LinkedIn. And the other thing is, if anyone's got any questions, just jump on LinkedIn and send me an email.
awesome.
I'm more than happy to chat.
And we're more than happy as well. If there's any questions that we missed or something, maybe pop them over and we'll share them in our Discord, etc. So once again, thank you ever so much. And thank you to all of the schools and colleges that have joined us as well, and to our students. Yeah, and thank you ever so much, and have a lovely day. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers.